I do wonder, though, how much it is dependent on President Trump, given that the hawks seem to be in the driving seat in Washington, whether it's in the White House or in Congress.
I think that's a pretty good point. The main issue that we see, and I think what we've seen in the last couple of days maybe reinforces that, is I think there was a hope at one point that goods tariffs could retain this kind of very specific area outside of foreign policy, almost kind of separated off. And what we've seen in the last couple of not only weeks but months is an increasing linkage between not just goods trade but also intellectual property, also security, and now kind of a foreign policy intervention on human rights. What that says for me is the same thing, which is that in a way President Trump is trying to decide the extent to which to push China and how much he might be able to get back in order to secure the kind of trade deal that he's spoken about, which is much more than what the Chinese have suggested more recently, much more than a kind of a very limited goods deal, and actually speaks to these wider structural issues between the U.S. and China.
Have you sensed any change in tone coming from Beijing at all when it comes to these trade talks and what they could be willing to compromise on?
I think China in some ways has been relatively steadfast, particularly since last summer and the kind of hardening in stance that we saw at that point. Since then, you've seen a kind of consistent view, which is willing to negotiate, keen to negotiate, what I would describe as a damage limitation strategy. But at the same time, the extent to which they are willing to completely transform their industrial policy, I think has not changed at all. If anything, that's articulated in the fact that they are looking to do this kind of more limited trade deal. And that's the important kind of thing to note, is on the Chinese side, they've been quite clear. They're willing to negotiate. They want to keep negotiating. And if they can put off the tariffs that have been so far at least announced but not yet implemented. But in terms of actually building a deal, the deal that China's talking about is quite different to the deal that Trump has traditionally spoken about.
Yeah, well, what's your reading of the U.S. strategy here? Because we hear the Chinese talking in what appear to be rather pragmatic terms of doing something small and achievable, while the U.S. wants a grand bargain and simultaneously opens multiple cans of worms. What's the strategy here?
I mean, as was said in the opening comments, the way I always describe this is President Trump is trying to decide what a win is for him looking towards the 2020 election. And, his voter base is supportive of taking on China. And so the extent to which at the moment a win is being tough on China, engaging, but being quite specific and quite stern in terms of his demands. But over time, particularly what we're looking for is, are there any signs that the negative implications from the trade war are leaking into elements that voters might care about? And crucially for us, that's the labour market. And so there is potentially a tipping point at which, if this economic stress becomes so severe that eventually the trade war is affecting jobs, that's a world in which I think the balance maybe slightly tilts so that maybe getting a deal becomes a win for Trump in the run-up to 2020. So I think January through kind of June and onwards, that'll be the time we start to see electioneering and decisions being made. But when we speak to people who are familiar with Trump's reasoning and his approach, they say he hasn't decided which of those things is a win yet.